will continue to be the host. Supposedly, Professor Chen is the host, but I think it's okay.
Okay, you just keep doing. Yeah.
So it's our great honor and pleasure again to introduce Professor Guy Marks. Professor Marks is a professor of respiratory medicine at University of New South Wales, the head of respiratory in environmental epidemiology, Woolcock Institute of Medical Research, which is also in Sydney University. So he's in the two best universities. He's also a PI for the Center for Air Pollution, Health, Energy, and Health Research, in short, CAR, C-A-R. So I have major question how that could be shortened in such a way. He's also a vice president of the International Union Against TB and Lung Disease, director of Australian Centre for Airway Disease Monitoring, a chair of New South Wales Chief Health Officers Advisory Committee, and many other titles. I will keep this short to that Guy has his time. Let's welcome Professor Marks.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I feel it's a great honor for me to be in this session. We've been given a big task by the global community who've agreed on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a global community, as a United Nations. And one of these, the third of them, is the area in which we work on health. It is quite a challenge to use both these things, I would say. But most of us in this room have spent our lives on this challenge, good health and well-being for the populations in which we live. And the particular focus that we have, as pointed out here by The Guardian, is the relationship between environment and good health. We're interested in the way in which the environment influences our health and how we can modify it and to mitigate its adverse effects on health. So what I wanted to discuss today, and the title that I've given is to consider what is our role as environmental epidemiologists and as scientists in exploring the relationship between the environment and good health. How can we contribute to policy in this field? So I would summarize our role in three points. First, I think we have to ask the right questions about the relationship between environment and health. Second, we need to get the best or the highest possible quality answers to those questions. And thirdly, we need to both interpret and translate those answers for the key stakeholders. And I use translate in its many different meanings. So I'm going to give, for the majority of this talk, if you'll bear with me, 3 case studies that I've been involved with. I think nearly everybody in this room has been involved in their own case studies, but I'm just going to choose 3 that I'm involved with, 2 which are from some time ago, and 1 of which is really just a proposal. It hasn't actually happened yet, the last one. The first 2 are from my own city of Sydney, and the third one is from a city in which I've spent quite a lot of time, Hanoi. So gas heaters in schools. Toxic heaters. These are what we refer to as unflued gas heaters. I think other people may use other terms to describe them, but they're heaters that are powered by either LPG gas or natural gas, which are sit in rooms and are not vented to the outside. So the only venting to the outside is if you open the window. And these are a very common, cheap form of heating which is used in Australian cities, and I think in many other cities around the world as well. They're probably about 50% of houses are heated by these unflued gas heaters, and they have the advantage for people that they're cheap, and they're also very effective. And they're widely used in schools as a form of heating. In the 1990s, there was a lot of concern about nitrogen dioxide that was generated by combustion of gas in schools and exposure and in homes, and exposure of people within the classrooms to nitrogen dioxide. And so the New South Wales Education Department, which runs all of the schools in the state of New South Wales, a vast number of schools, decided that they would replace all the existing unflued gas heaters with ones which were developed and which were sold to them as being low NOx gas heaters. In other words, heaters that had low levels of nitrogen dioxide emitted from them. This somewhat unfortunate thing that they forgot to do was to check that they were actually low NOx gas heaters. And so sometime later, in the 2000s, people started to do measurements in classrooms and were concerned that there were, in fact, there were significant levels of nitrogen dioxide in the classrooms that were being heated. And this caused a great furore, particularly in the colder areas of the state where children were being exposed to this a lot. And so we got these headlines in the newspapers about toxic heaters in New South Wales schools. The Education Department was under a lot of pressure from parliamentarians, from politicians, and asked the New South Wales Department of Health whether these heaters that they'd installed were actually safe. The New South Wales Department of Health said, "We don't know the answer to that, you need to do a study." So they came to us and commissioned us to do a study. So the background is that most schools use these unflued gas heaters. There were concerns about this. There was concerns about nitrogen dioxide, which, as you know, is the combustion product and is an irritant. And they asked the question, are these unflued gas heaters associated with short-term adverse respiratory health effects? So we proposed as the research question, are children who are exposed to these low NOx unflued gas heaters compared to children who are exposed to an alternative non-fume emitting heater at increased short-term risk of respiratory symptoms, impaired lung function and airway inflammation? That was the question that we proposed to answer to address the problem that the New South Wales Education Department had given us. So we decided to do this using an intervention study, an experimental design, a cluster randomised, double-blind crossover study. So just to explain what that was, we recruited 22 schools which were currently being heated by these unflued gas heaters and chose one classroom from within each school. These schools were the clusters. And the participants were the children who were in those classes. In total, in the 22 schools, there were 400 participants, 400 primary schools. And we conducted the experimental study for 6 weeks. In each classroom, we added a flued gas heater, that is a vented gas heater, as a control in each classroom. So that in each classroom, we set up this sort of arrangement. 2 heaters that appeared identical next to each other. One was the pre-existing unvented or unflued gas heater, and one was an identical appearing gas heater, but which was vented to the outside through a hole in the wall. It had a vent. And so the vented gas heater did not emit anything into the classroom, and the unvented or unflued gas heater was the existing type of heater. And we set this up so that they could be switched from one operating to the other operating over the weekend. And on the weekend, we had an engineer went into the classroom and switched from one to the other. And we randomly assigned the order in which the children would be exposed. So that this is just an example of the schema, but there were 22 schools. This just shows the first 4 schools. And the randomisation, there were 3 blocks of 2 weeks each. And in each block, 1 week was randomly assigned to be the fluid or control, and the other was the unfluid or exposed. And which order they were in was randomly assigned. So in some cases they started with the fluid, in some cases they started with the unfluid. So each school got 3 weeks of exposure to the fluid gas heater and 3 weeks of exposure to the unfluid gas heater. So it was a randomised, double-blind crossover study with 3 crossover periods. During this time, the school teacher operated the heater using a control in the same way that they would normally operate the heater. So if it was cold, they turned on the heater. If it was not cold, they turned off the heater. But they were thermostatically controlled, and they just operated the heater without knowing which was the one that was actually in circuit. So we measured 2 things. We measured some gases in the classroom. We measured nitrogen dioxide and formaldehyde, and we measured symptoms and lung function using a diary card for all of the children. We also were concerned to test whether or not our blinding had worked, and one of the ways we tested that was because this was a highly political issue, and we thought if people became unblinded, it would not be difficult for people to manipulate the study. So we included within it some questions which were designed to be distracting questions, if you like, questions which we thought were very unlikely to be related to symptoms of from the unfluid gas heater. So, and they were questions about abdominal pain, for example. But most of the other symptoms were symptoms about that we were looking for: cough and phlegm, wheeze, and upper respiratory tract symptoms. And we measured those symptoms twice a day using this diary card, and we also measured FEV1 and peak flow twice a day using a handheld spirometer. So, not unexpectedly, the unfluid gas heaters were in fact associated with higher levels of both NO2 and formaldehyde. So remember, the same classrooms, but during different periods. So during the period of operation of the unfluid gas heater, NO2 levels and formaldehyde levels were higher. During the period of the vented gas heater, the levels were lower. So that was not surprising. I'm just going to go through the results very quickly because of time, but we showed very small adverse effects on respiratory symptoms. This is the intention to treat analysis. This is the primary analysis showing that cough in the afternoon was slightly more common during the period of operation of the unfluid gas heater, but in the morning it was not more common. We also did some other analyses to this, what we call per protocol, was we also recorded when the heater was actually being used compared to when it was turned off by the teacher. So this was taking account of the periods when the heaters were actually in use as opposed to being turned off. This was adjusting for some time variable covariates, and this was a interaction that we tested to see whether atopic children with positive skin prick tests were more at risk than those who were not. But generally speaking, the although the confidence intervals are wider in some of these other analyses, they were all consistent with a small increase in the risk of cough in the afternoon and an increase in the risk of wheeze in the morning. So this here is an increased risk of wheeze in the morning, which is again consistent across all of these analyses, but actually greater in those who are atopic. So the children there was a subgroup, about 50% of the children had positive skin prick tests indicating atopy, and in that subgroup they were at greater risk of having these symptoms due to exposure to the unflued gas heater. So, but there was no difference in lung function, and if anything, what this shows actually is that in the per protocol analysis, lung function was actually higher during the period of operation of the unflued gas heaters. There was no decrease in lung function during the period of operation of the unflued gas heaters. So at first sight, this seems rather counterintuitive. Why should there be more symptoms but not worse lung function? So this discordance, in one way, it gives us some reassurance that we're not seeing severe adverse effects due to the unflued gas heaters. And there are possible explanations, and the two that came to our mind was that we also did show, and I didn't show these data, that the children tended to use more bronchodilators, reliever medications, and so the use of those reliever medications may have actually resulted in higher lung function. But it's also possible that the effects that they were reporting, the wheeze or chest tightness and the cough, were not in fact mediated by airway narrowing, but were mediated more by a sensory phenomenon. We don't have any way from this study of distinguishing which is the real reason for this. So we concluded that classroom exposure to these so-called low NOx unflued gas heaters is associated with actually higher exposure to nitrogen dioxide and formaldehyde, and is associated with increased symptoms, particularly in atopic children, but without adverse effects on lung function. And if you wanted to read more details, that's the paper that reports it. So what happened? Well, the day that this paper was published, it was a highly political thing, in fact. I had to appear before the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament in order to prevent this being released before it was published. And when it was published, the New South Wales Minister for Education announced that she was going to replace all of the heaters in New South Wales schools. The problem was that she hadn't got permission from the Treasury to do this, and so it never happened. The Treasury did a cost-benefit analysis and decided that it wasn't worthwhile. And so they reached a compromise, as always. We're very good at that in Australia. So we had a compromise where unflued gas heaters were replaced in coldest parts of the state where they were used, but they weren't in fact replaced in most of the schools, which I thought was probably reasonable. But I heard, this was like 10 years ago, but I heard just last week, I think for other reasons, that the state government has decided it's going to install reverse cycle air conditioners in New South Wales schools. So quite what the reason for that is, I don't know. I don't know whether they've rediscovered our study or what. So this is an interesting political case. I think we were discussing yesterday with colleagues how environmental health is a highly political discipline, and it is. And this is, the next one I'm going to give is another example of a highly political, controversial case. New motorways. Motorways in all cities are a huge issue, and they're a big issue in Sydney. Sydney, for those who don't know, is a city, I gather it's about the same size as Taipei. It's about 5 million people, and it has a lot of cars, and it's a very big geographical area. It's about, I think, about 80 kilometres across, something like that. And we have this rim of motorways. A ring of motorways are going around the city, but until about 10 years ago, there was one gap in that ring, and it was here at the Lane Cove tunnel. And because what they've done in many of these motorways across Sydney is to build tunnels. What it's not shown actually properly here, but many of these, large parts of this ring are actually tunnels. This part, which is what we were investigating, this part here, a part here, and a big long tunnel here. And in fact, now they're building another tunnel here. So large parts of this are being built as tunnels, and another tunnel is currently being built here. But they're a major source of controversy. But this was the one that we were investigating, this tunnel being built here, being built to bypass a major road. We were asked to assess whether the effects of opening of this tunnel, the LCT stands for the Lane Cove Tunnel, that's the name of the tunnel, on the concentration and distribution of traffic-related air pollution. So this is a closer-up view of the area in which we were doing this study. So this is the road network. This is the existing road that was to be bypassed. The road shown here in green is the existing road, which is heavily built up area, lots of people living along it. And this is the tunnel that was designed to bypass it. And those two things are stacks, ventilation stacks designed to ventilate, to vent the tunnel. These stacks are a huge political issue in Australia. People look at these ventilation stacks and they think of chimneys, they think of coal-fired power stations, they think of steelworks, they think of Eastern European industry, they think of pollution. In fact, so they're a great sort of way of concentrating people's attention on road traffic-related pollution. People are very concerned about them. And the people living around them were very concerned about them. So the stakeholders' concerns were about the ventilation stacks, about the increased flow of traffic on the feeder roads into the tunnel, and whether there were any benefits for residents living along the main road. The residents living along the main road had in fact been campaigning for this tunnel to happen, and the authorities were very convinced that this was going to cause major benefits to health. So this was people concerned about adverse effects and people concerned to demonstrate beneficial effects. This is probably the most intensively monitored a few square kilometres of the world in terms of these are all fully fledged air pollution monitor stations that were established in the area around where this tunnel was going to be built. And this thing here demonstrates our study area. So we decided to do a land use regression model as part of our work, and we also conducted a cohort study. But I'm just going to show you the work we did on the land use regression model to demonstrate changes in air pollution. So we set up a network of NO2 passive samplers across the site. These were 42 sites, 3 sampling periods for 2 weeks each during 3 seasons of the year. And these dots here, these pins, represent the sites where we chose to put these passive samplers. And we collected a whole lot of data about land use, about population density, road types, traffic counts, elevation, and we used this data to construct a land use regression model. And this heat map shows the land use regression model essentially. I don't really have time to go into how it was implemented, but what the land use regression model shows is the darker red colours and yellow colours show high levels of NO2, and the blue colours show lower levels of NO2. And this is a cross-sectional view of what the land use regression model looked like. But what we were really interested in was change. What we were interested in was change over time. And between the period before the tunnel was opened, when traffic was running along that main surface road, and the year after the tunnel was opened, when traffic was bypassing that main surface road and running through the tunnel. And that's what we've implemented, that's what this figure shows. So this was the main outcome of this longitudinal land use regression model, showing changes in nitrogen dioxide level in the area affected by the tunnel. And what it shows is, as you might predict, the levels of NO2 were substantially reduced along the main road and a short distance from the main road that was being bypassed. It was slightly increased along the feeder roads. These were the freeways that go into the tunnel, so slightly increased along there, and large areas further away from the tunnel where there was no change in the concentration of NO2, and there was no detectable change in the areas around the ventilation stacks, which were here and here. So we concluded that the Lane Cove Tunnel did in fact result in a substantial change in the distribution of traffic-related air pollution, particularly NO2 in this case. The greatest change occurred along the route that was bypassed by the main road. There was some beneficial effect seen on secondary main roads, but it was consistent with what had been seen previously. In fact, that was reported in this study here, the redistribution of traffic-related air pollution along the tunnel. What I haven't shown you here is that we also did a health study associated with that. In fact, we did a number of health studies, both following a cohort and also we did some so-called picnic studies, again randomised controlled trial type studies, where we, within this environment, and they're also reported here. And so it was a sort of a fairly major enterprise, but I just wanted to show you a sample of one of the pieces of work that we did in relation to that traffic-related intervention. And this involved a whole lot of people. The main person I should acknowledge in relation to this is Christine Cowie, who was at that time, PhD student who worked on this project and continues to work with me. And we had a lot of funding from a number of agencies for assistance with this. The third thing I wanted to talk about is Hong Kong. This is Hanoi, not Hong Kong, Hanoi. This is Du Lik, a tourist boat on the Red River in Hanoi. And I've been going to Hanoi for more than 10 years. And this is the sort of view that I usually see in Hanoi, not very much blue sky. It's a heavily polluted city, and it's very hard to see the opposite bank of the Red River. It's interesting that air pollution from the Global Burden of Disease study, I'm mainly working in Vietnam on tuberculosis, and tuberculosis kills about 15,000 people a year in Vietnam, 15 to 20,000 people a year. But the Global Burden of Disease study has estimated that there are 70,000 deaths a year that are attributed to air pollution in Vietnam. Interesting that if you ask people in the health department in Vietnam what's their major environmental hazard, what do they spend most of their efforts on? It's unsafe water, hand washing and sanitation. Unsafe water is their major concern. But according to Global Burden of Disease, they're looking at the wrong thing. The huge burden of disease is attributable to air pollution, and there is very little research going on air pollution in Vietnam. I've been concerned for some time that we're not doing very much on this, and that mitigating this hazard requires governments to promulgate, implement and monitor policies to reduce exposure to air pollutants. And for this to happen, we need to provide evidence. So I've been working with some colleagues in Vietnam and in Australia to put forward a proposal which we at the moment have in for funding. It's not yet funded, but there is a current scheme that's being will be jointly funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia and the National Science Council of Vietnam, NAFOSTED, and so we have a grant into that joint call at the moment to do this project. And the project aims to provide evidence base to underpin policy to improve public health by effective abatement, and also to build human and technical capacity in Vietnam to underpin research and also monitoring and evaluation. So the elements, just briefly, of what we're proposing to do is to estimate, we're proposing to do this initially just in Hanoi, although Hanoi is the second largest city in Vietnam. The biggest city and the most polluted city, I'm finished in a minute, is Ho Chi Minh City. So we'll be doing land use regression modelling, much as what I've just described to you before, but adding in data from fixed site monitors and from satellite data. We'll be doing some work on identifying emission sources using various approaches to source apportionment. Prima facie, the main sources are traffic, burning of briquettes of organic material for cooking, coal-fired power stations, and burning of agricultural burning. But the relative importance of each of that is not really known. There's very poor quality data on vital statistics, so we'll be collecting our own vital statistics data, including doing some verbal autopsies on randomly selected sample of deaths, and we'll be looking at some hospitalisation data. And then we'll be implementing a health risk assessment using a standardised methodology based on the information that we've collected. We'll be doing using some of the methods of implementation science to consult with stakeholders in various government ministries, local government, and with community organisations, which are called unions. And based on this, we hope to be able to formulate a plan that's acceptable and feasible and that are shown to be effective. So last slide here is, second last slide. The key roles for environmental epidemiology, in my view, is to identify what are the relevant policy questions, what are the policy relevant questions, I should say, to optimise the study designs to address those questions, to optimise our methods of exposure assessment and of outcome assessment, and to consult with stakeholders throughout the process, starting from the design of the study questions. This is a process that needs to happen, and to utilise what's now known as implementation science or knowledge translation. I would see those as our major roles as environmental epidemiologists. And just finally, this is some of the study group at the Woolcock Institute with one of our bridges behind. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marks. I think we researchers sometimes forget the policy-related issues and just enjoy our curiosity. But the policy is very important to change our world, I think. So your talk is very insightful for us to keep that issue in my mind, in our mind, I think. Due to the time limit, we don't have time to question or comments today, but here's something we'd like to deliver